There comes a moment in every woman's life when she pauses long enough to hear the truth she has been avoiding. A moment when the world becomes unbearably quiet and she realizes that she has not been chasing a man, a dream, or love at all. She has been chasing a missing part of herself. This moment does not arrive with fireworks or dramatic collapse. It comes with a soft, almost invisible shift inside her, a whisper that says, "Stop trying so hard. He was never the thing you needed to catch." And in that silence, something ancient stirs within her, something she has carried since childhood, but buried beneath expectations, disappointments, and the fear of being overlooked. She begins to sense that her patterns were never random. They were the echoes of the shadow she never learned to face, the persona she used to survive, and the self she has always been moving toward even when she felt lost. Most women do not realize that their deepest longing is not for someone to choose them, but for a moment when they no longer abandon themselves. Jung believed that the unconscious organizes our lives until we learn to see it. And for many women, the unconscious takes the shape of a familiar ache, the fear of being too much and not enough at the same time, the confusion of loving deeply yet feeling unseen, the exhaustion of giving everything while receiving so little in return. She wonders why she keeps attracting men who cannot meet her, why she feels her heart pull strongest toward what slips away, why the more she tries to hold on, the faster everything fades. But beneath those questions lives a deeper truth. She has been acting from a vibration of lack, not because she is weak, but because no one ever taught her the difference between pursuing connection and abandoning herself in the process. She grew up believing that love must be earned, maintained, impressed, secured. She learned to monitor tone read, silence, fill emotional gaps before anyone asked. She became fluent in emotional labor long before she learned to speak for herself. And so she learned to chase, not with her feet, but with her nervous system, her fear, her overthinking, her people-pleasing, her anxious desire to hold what feels safer than the void. But what she did not know was that chasing doesn't just exhaust a woman. It distorts her energy, and when her energy bends toward fear, the world bends away from her. Jung wrote that when a woman hides her shadow, she invites others to carry it for her, and so she attracts partners who mirror the parts of herself she refuses to acknowledge: unworthiness, fear, abandonment, silence, self-doubt. Yet this is not a punishment. It is a summons, a mirror, a call to return to the self. Because the moment a woman stops reaching outward, the moment she withdraws her energy from where it leaks, the moment she learns to become still rather than frantic, everything around her begins to shift. Men respond differently. Life responds differently. The world recognizes something in her it had overlooked before, not because she has become more beautiful, strategic, mysterious, or impressive, but because she has become more whole. When a woman returns to herself, she becomes magnetic, not through seduction, but through truth. This is not the truth that comes from logic, but from integration. The moment when her inner child is no longer steering the ship, when her wounds stop choosing her lovers, when her fear stops whispering that she must perform to be worthy. A woman who no longer abandons herself carries a gravity that cannot be faked. And as she steps into this new frequency, she begins to understand what no one told her. Love is not something she earns. It is something she aligns with. Attention is not something she chases. It is something that flows toward her when she stops gaslighting her own intuition. Connection is not something she negotiates. It is something that meets her at the level of her self-respect. The journey ahead is not about finding the right man, but finding the right relationship with herself, so that the world knows how to treat her. She is not here to be chosen. She is here to choose. She is not here to cling. She is here to stand. And she is not here to chase. She is here to become. This video is her path back not to him, but to herself. Chapter 1. The hidden frequency that shapes what you attract. There is a moment in every woman's life when she begins to realize that something deeper than her words, her actions, or her desires has been shaping her relationships all along. A moment when she notices that she can say all the right things, act with grace, offer warmth and softness, but still watch someone pull away as if her heart were speaking a language she herself cannot hear. And this moment, subtle but earth-shattering, is the awakening to her hidden frequency, the silent signal beneath her behavior, the unspoken vibration beneath her smile, the energy that enters a room before she does and tells a story she has never learned to translate. Most women believe men respond to their effort, their beauty, their kindness, their consistency. But Jung understood something far more unsettling. People do not respond to what you present. They respond to the unconscious material you radiate. And for many women, that radiation carries the echoes of old wounds, abandonment, unworthiness, fear of being too much or not enough, anxiety about being forgotten, the silent belief that love must be chased because it does not naturally stay. She wonders why she keeps attracting avoidance, emotional distance, or men who pull her close only to disappear. And she blames her timing, her value, her softness, her mistakes. But the truth is far more paradoxical. The more desperately she wants to be chosen, the more her frequency whispers the opposite. I am afraid, I am uncertain, I am waiting to be rejected, and I am terrified you will see the parts of me I still cannot accept. What she does not yet know is that the nervous system is a transmitter, and the unconscious is a loudspeaker. Long before she sends a text or speaks a word, her energy is already speaking on her behalf. So she enters a new connection with hope, but also with tension hiding beneath her ribs. She listens for tone, watches for signs, reads pauses as warnings, and her heart begins running before the relationship even walks. The man feels something he cannot name, a subtle pull that feels like pressure, a warmth laced with fear, an invitation coated in expectation. And though she says she is easygoing, patient, taking things slow, her energy says, please don't leave. Please choose me. Please don't become another story I have to recover from. And humans, Jung reminds us, are far more sensitive to the unconscious than they realize. We feel the energy of others before we see their intentions, and so the man steps back, not because she is unworthy, but because she is vibrating at the frequency of loss. At this stage, many women blame the universe or the cruelty of dating or the lack of emotionally available men. But this is the moment of truth she must face when her energy chases everything she desires begins to retreat. It is not punishment, it is resonance. It is physics of the heart. It is how the self protects her from relationships built on fear rather than presence. Jung believed that the self, the deepest, most whole version of a woman, cannot participate in a relationship she enters from abandonment because anything born from lack cannot grow into love. So her life begins presenting the same pattern, not to break her, but to reveal her. Every man who pulls away, every conversation that fades, every connection that collapses under its own weight is a mirror held up to her unconscious saying, this is the vibration you are emitting. This is the part that needs your attention. A woman's frequency is shaped not by her intentions, but by her unhealed stories. If she carries the belief that she must earn love, she will attract men who make her prove it. If she carries the belief that she is replaceable, she will attract men who treat her as convenient. If she carries the belief that she is too much, she will attract those who can only hold fragments of her light. And if she carries the belief that she is not enough, she will attract men who leave her questioning herself again and again, until she learns to stop questioning and start looking inward. But here is the turning point. The moment this lesson pivots from pain to power, once she becomes aware of the frequency she emits, she gains the ability to transform it. Healing does not begin when she stops loving men. Healing begins when she stops abandoning herself in the pursuit of them. She begins noticing the urge to reach out first, to explain herself, to fix misunderstandings, not caused by her to prove she is different from women in his past, to predict his thoughts before he expresses them. And instead of acting on these impulses, she pauses. Just one pause, one breath, one shift. Jung called this the observing self, the part of her that steps out of the unconscious pattern and watches it rather than obeying it. In the pause, she discovers something astonishing. The urge to chase is not about him. It is about the little girl inside her who still fears being forgotten. The urge to overgive is not about the relationship. It is about her nervous system remembering a time when love felt unstable. The urge to control the outcome is not about the present man. It is about her shadow, those unintegrated parts of her that believe safety is something earned through effort. And in that awareness, the pattern begins to unravel. Slowly, quietly, elegantly. Because the moment she witnesses her unconscious, she stops being driven by it. The moment she recognizes her fear, she stops transmitting it. The moment she chooses presence over performance, her frequency strengthens. And something begins to shift in her aura, her posture, her emotional gravity. The world senses it. First, people respond differently. Men speak to her differently. Conversations flow with less urgency and more intention. And even silence begins to feel safe because it no longer threatens her identity. She is no longer waiting to be chosen. She is choosing herself in real time. This is the moment when her energy stops chasing the moment when she radiates rather than reaches the moment when she becomes a woman whose presence is felt before she even speaks. This is not the end of the journey. It is the first doorway, the first awakening, the first crack in the old identity that kept her small. And as she steps through it, she begins to understand what no one taught her. When a woman learns to control her frequency, she learns to control her life, and nothing and no one can pull her away from herself again. Chapter 2. The woman who mistook her wounds for destiny. Every transformation begins with a single story, and this is the story of Elise, a woman whose life looked beautifully composed on the outside, yet inside she carried an emotional frequency. She did not know how to hear a frequency that shaped every connection she touched without her consent. Elise was the kind of woman people described as strong, capable, resilient. Labels she wore like soft armor, polished with years of pretending she was unaffected, unbothered, unshakable. But beneath that curated strength lived a quiet longing. She dared not reveal a longing to finally rest in a love that did not require her to shrink, perform, or fight for space. Jung would have called this her persona, the mask she wore to survive the world. But behind that mask was a shadow filled with unspoken fears. The fear of being overlooked, the fear of not being chosen, the fear that if someone saw her fully, they would walk away. For most of her adult life, Elise believed these fears were private thoughts invisible to others, contained by her silence. Yet the men she dated seemed to instinctively feel them, as if her unconscious was speaking in a language louder than her voice. She entered each new connection with hope, but also with a familiar tension pressed beneath her ribs, a tension she interpreted as intuition. But it was not intuition. It was memory, the unresolved echo of past emotional winters resurfacing in the presence of new beginnings. The man she met most recently, Daniel, seemed different at first. He was steady, soft-spoken, thoughtful in ways that made her feel safe. But Jung warned that the unconscious does not disappear just because a new person enters our life. It resurfaces seeking resolution. So even as Daniel offered warmth, Elise felt the familiar flicker of fear beneath her calm exterior. When he took longer to reply, her thoughts spiraled. When he seemed distracted, her chest tightened. When he didn't mirror her enthusiasm, she interpreted it as rejection. And every time her mind ran ahead of reality, her frequency followed, transmitting a silent message she did not know she was sending. Please don't disappear. I don't know who I am if you do. What Elise could not yet see was that her reactions had nothing to do with Daniel and everything to do with the emotional blueprint she carried, a blueprint shaped by years of learning to equate worth with being needed love, with being chosen safety, with being pursued. This was her psychological inheritance, written long before adulthood, long before dating, long before Daniel ever walked into her life. Jung believed that until a woman meets her shadow, she will call every repeated wound bad luck and every emotional pattern destiny. But destiny is simply the name we give to unconscious repetition. Elise was living inside such a loop without realizing it. She thought she was falling for Daniel, but she was actually falling into an old story inside herself, one where she feared abandonment so deeply that she unconsciously recreated it. When she felt anxious, she over-explained. When she sensed distance, she compensated. When she felt uncertainty, she offered more than what was asked. Daniel felt her tenderness, but he also felt the invisible pressure behind it, the emotional weight she never intended to hand him. Jung taught that people respond to what we are not what we say, and Daniel felt something Elise could not name, an expectation coated in softness, a longing wrapped in fear, a woman reaching for reassurance in moments he had not yet created. Slowly, subtly, he began stepping back, not because Elise was wrong, but because her unhealed parts were asking him for a role he did not sign up to play. One evening, after a long day at work, Elise sat alone in her apartment, staring at her silent phone, her heart sinking in a way that felt far too familiar. She whispered to herself, "Why does this keep happening to me?" The universe answered her question not with a man's presence, but with her own reflection. In the stillness of that moment, she saw something she had never allowed herself to see. She was chasing emotional certainty, not connection. She wasn't asking to be loved. She was asking to be stabilized. She wanted Daniel to silence the fears she never learned to comfort within herself, and that realization broke her open. Jung believed that healing begins the moment a woman stops running from the truth of her own heart and in that silence, Elise finally met hers. She remembered the nights she had cried quietly as a child, hoping someone would notice. She remembered the teenage years spent learning to be low maintenance because she feared being a burden. She remembered the relationships where she accepted crumbs, believing crumbs were all she deserved. These memories were not weaknesses. They were the portals to her unconscious, the entry points into her individuation, the process of becoming whole. For the first time, Elise understood that the intensity she felt in new relationships was not passion. It was unresolved memory, calling for integration. She also realized something more profound. She'd been entering relationships not as a grounded woman, but as a wounded girl, still searching for the love she never fully received. No wonder her frequency trembled. No wonder her heart felt unsteady. No wonder men felt pressure she never intended to give. The body remembers everything the mind tries to forget. But here is where her story diverges from her past. Instead of blaming herself, instead of spiraling into self-criticism, Elise did something revolutionary. She softened. She placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "I see you." It was the first time she had spoken to herself with the tenderness she reserved for others. And this tiny moment, this almost invisible shift, was the beginning of her energetic transformation. Jung said that the shadow is not healed by punishment, but by understanding. And Elise was finally understanding that her old patterns were not failures. They were survival strategies that had expired. What she needed now was not perfection, but presence. Not control, but awareness. Not certainty, but self-trust. In the days that followed, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of checking her phone every few minutes, she let the silence breathe. Instead of over-explaining her feelings, she allowed them to exist without justification. Instead of internalizing every pause, she reminded herself, his behavior is information, not a verdict on my worth. Her energy shifted, not dramatically, but steadily, like the quiet strengthening of a spine that had been bent for years. Daniel felt it immediately. Her messages became lighter, her presence less urgent, her energy more grounded. She was no longer reaching for him, she was reaching into herself. And without realizing it, Elise had stepped into the most powerful phase of her awakening. A woman who no longer negotiates her worth vibrates differently. This shift did not guarantee the relationship would last. That was not the point. The point was that Elise had finally interrupted the unconscious pattern that had shaped her life for years. She was no longer reenacting abandonment. She was reclaiming herself. And in doing so, she began attracting life not from fear, but from fullness. This was her initiation. This was her first descent into her shadow, and her first rise into herself. And from this point forward, nothing in her emotional world would ever be the same. She had taken the first step toward becoming a woman whose energy draws what is meant for her and releases what is not even before she consciously chooses it. Chapter 3. Jung's Map of the Inner World, where her patterns are born. Every woman believes she knows herself until life shows her the parts she has never met, the deeper layers beneath her personality, the forgotten corridors of her emotional world, and Jung understood this better than anyone. He believed that the greatest illusion is that we are governed only by our conscious mind, when in truth, what shapes a woman's love life, what draws her towards certain men, what repels her from others, what makes her anxious in silence, hopeful in uncertainty, or terrified of losing connection, does not originate from her logic. It originates from her unconscious, a complex and ancient architecture she has been carrying since childhood. To understand Elise and to understand any woman who finds herself repeating emotional cycles, we must enter the landscape. Jung devoted his life to mapping the shadow, the persona, the ego, and the self. Think of the persona. First, the curated version of a woman she learns to present to the world, the good girl, the strong woman, the low-maintenance partner, the mask that smiles even when her heart is shaking, the voice that says, "I'm fine," even when she aches for reassurance she cannot ask for. The persona is not a lie. It is a survival strategy shaped by early experiences, shaped by environment, shaped by the 1,000 small moments in which she learned what parts of herself were welcomed and what parts were ignored. Behind that mask lives the shadow, the hidden emotional material she has disowned, the fear of abandonment. She hides under independence, the longing for affection she hides under pride, the need for validation she hides under calmness, the trembling vulnerability she hides under strength. Jung said the shadow is everything a woman rejects in herself because she once believed those qualities made her unlovable, and these rejected parts do not disappear. They gather in silence, waiting to be acknowledged, and if she does not meet them consciously, they will meet her in the form of emotional triggers, anxious thoughts, or repeated relationships that reopen the same wound again and again. And then there is the ego, the part of her trying desperately to maintain control, to predict outcomes, to protect her from rejection, to negotiate her worth through effort or emotional labor, the part that whispers, "If I try harder, he won't leave," or "If I say nothing, he won't lose interest," or "If I stay quiet, I won't scare him away." The ego means well. It is trying to protect her from the wounds she has not healed. But the irony is tragic. The more it tries to protect her from abandonment, the more it creates behaviors that signal abandonment to others. This is why Elise felt anxious even when nothing was wrong, why she interpreted silence as danger, why Daniel felt pressure. Even when she spoke gently, the ego interprets the present through the lens of the past. But it is the self, the deepest, most whole, most grounded part of a woman that holds the truth. She needs the part that knows she is worthy without being chosen. The part that knows love cannot come from her fear. The part that knows attraction cannot grow in the soil of insecurity. The part that waits patiently beneath the noise of her mind, whispering, "You are already enough. Stop running from yourself." For most women, the journey to the self is blocked by the shadow, because the shadow contains everything she has not yet accepted: her anger, her jealousy, her fear, her loneliness, her longing, her sensitivity, her softness, her need. These parts were never the problem. Her shame around them was. Jung believed the shadow becomes dangerous not because of its darkness, but because of its invisibility. What a woman cannot see in herself, she will project onto the men she meets. Elise projected her childhood fear of being forgotten onto Daniel. She read pauses as rejection because her nervous system remembered being overlooked. She interpreted silence as abandonment because silence had once hurt her. She feared being too much because someone once made her believe that wanting connection was a flaw. When a woman does not meet her shadow, she dates from memory instead of presence. She responds not to the man before her, but to the phantom of past pain walking beside him. And this is the tragedy. She believes she is reacting to her partner, when in truth, she is reacting to the unhealed girl inside her, who still thinks safety must be earned. But when a woman begins to understand Jung's map, when she sees the persona she uses to hide the shadow, she avoids the ego that tries too hard, the self that waits within her, everything begins to shift. Awareness becomes medicine. She notices when her persona says, "Be easygoing so he doesn't get scared," and she pauses. She notices when her shadow whispers, "You don't deserve love unless you prove your worth," and she breathes. She notices when her ego tightens her chest and says, "Text him again so you don't lose him," and she stays still. In the stillness, she hears the voice of the self. It is calmer, quieter, slower, but it carries a depth her fear has never known. It says, "You do not need to chase anything. What is meant for you cannot be pulled away by silence." Slowly, Elise begins to detach from the illusion that relationships collapse because she is not enough. She begins to see they collapse because she entered them from fear. Jung said that when the unconscious is not made conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And Elise had spent years believing her pattern was fate, that heartbreak was destiny, that anxiety was just part of her sensitivity. But now she saw the truth. Her unconscious had been writing her love stories for years, and she had been living them on autopilot. Emotional liberation begins not when a woman fixes herself, but when she finally understands herself. And the moment Elise recognized how her inner world shaped her outer world, she gained a power she had never felt before, the power to choose differently. For the first time, she understood why the wrong men felt familiar, why calm men felt confusing, why healthy love felt foreign. She was not drawn to chaos. She was drawn to what matched her wound. She was not attracted to inconsistency. She was reenacting her past. She did not fear intimacy. She feared being seen by someone who could not heal her. Jung believed that the greatest act of love a woman can offer herself is to turn inward and retrieve the parts she abandoned long ago, because only then does she stop trying to find those missing parts in someone else. Elise was just beginning this journey, but even this beginning carried power. She was no longer blaming destiny. She was decoding her patterns. She was no longer mourning men who left. She was mourning the pieces of herself she had abandoned. She was no longer asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" She was asking, "Which part of me is creating this?" And this one shift, this quiet, unglamorous, deeply psychological shift marked the moment Elise began stepping out of the unconscious and into herself. Her relationships might still challenge her triggers, may still arise. Old memories might still whisper, but now she was equipped with a map. Jung's map. Her map. The map of a woman on the verge of becoming whole. She did not know it yet, but everything in her life was about to ask her one question. Are you ready to meet yourself? And for the first time, Elise felt brave enough to say yes. Chapter 4. The Echo of the Wound. Why she keeps reliving the same story. Every woman who has loved deeply has at some point whispered to herself, "Why do I keep ending up in the same story?" And Elise was no exception. It was as if life had been handing her the same man with a different name, the same ending with a different beginning, the same heartbreak wrapped in slightly different words. And Jung warned that this is not coincidence. It is the psyche calling her back to the place where something still needs to be healed. But Elise didn't know this yet. All she knew was that despite her awareness, despite learning about her shadow and her persona, despite noticing her impulses and trying to soften them, something strange still kept happening whenever she began caring for someone her emotional world activated like a storm. It wasn't dramatic or obvious from the outside. It was subtle, almost elegant in its invisibility. A pause in communication became a threat. A shift in tone felt like a warning. A neutral expression became a sign of fading interest. Elise's mind translated every ambiguous moment into abandoned girl logic, not because the man was hurting her, but because the wounded part of her had been trained to expect hurt. Jung called this phenomenon the complex and autonomous emotional force shaped by past experiences that hijacks a woman's perception without her consent. And when a complex is activated, she does not respond to the present moment. She responds to the original wound that created it. And here lies the truth. No one tells women a pattern does not repeat because she is flawed. It repeats because her psyche is trying to complete what was once left unfinished. So life sends her emotionally unavailable men not to punish her but to help her see her own unavailability to herself. It sends her men who pull away to show her the part of her that still abandons her own needs. It sends her men who are inconsistent to highlight the instability inside her that was never soothed. It sends her silence to reveal the noise inside her mind. It sends her rejection to reveal the parts of herself she has not yet accepted. This is the psychological law Jung described as the compulsion to repeat the unconscious attempt to re-enter an old wound in hopes of finally rewriting its ending. But the tragedy is that she often reenacts the wound instead of healing it, because she enters the story with the same identity she had the first time she was hurt. And Elise was beginning to see this. Her story with Daniel was unfolding slowly, but beneath the surface she felt the old pattern tugging at her chest like a hidden thread pulling her into the past. One night, lying in bed with her phone buzzing softly beside her, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't afraid of losing Daniel. She was afraid of losing the version of herself she wanted him to validate. That fear had nothing to do with him. It belonged to a younger version of her, a girl who once equated worth with being chosen a girl, still frozen in the memory of not being enough for someone she loved. And Jung insisted that these younger psychological selves live inside every adult woman, shaping her reactions without her awareness, waiting for her to turn inward and bring them home. Elise decided to stop running from her discomfort and instead face it directly. She sat up, closed her eyes, and allowed the tight ache in her chest to speak. Images surfaced, fragmented, emotional, vivid. She saw herself at 8 years old, sitting on the edge of her childhood bed, waiting for a parent who often came home too tired to listen. She saw herself at 16, giving her heart to a boy who only held it when convenient. She saw herself at 23, convincing herself she didn't need affection because it felt safer to pretend she didn't care. She saw the same expression on her face in every memory, a quiet, desperate hope that someone would finally stay. And then Elise understood something that felt like both a revelation and a heartbreak. She wasn't chasing men, she was chasing closure. She wasn't afraid of losing Daniel. She was afraid of reliving a wound that had never been allowed to heal. And every time a man pulled away, every time someone went quiet, every time uncertainty rose, her nervous system replayed the same script, not because she was weak, but because she had learned to equate emotional activation with emotional truth. This realization changed everything. For the first time in her life, Elise separated feeling from fact. Her chest tightening did not mean he was leaving. Her spiraling thoughts did not mean love was collapsing. Her fear of being forgotten did not mean she was forgettable. Jung said the unconscious becomes destructive only when ignored, but once engaged. Once brought into the light, it becomes a guide rather than a saboteur. And Elise was beginning to change her relationship with her wound. Instead of trying to silence it with reassurance, she sat with it. Instead of trying to fix it with overgiving, she breathed through it. Instead of interpreting every pause as danger, she told herself gently, "This is an old fear speaking. I am no longer that girl." And though her body still trembled, her awareness became the anchor she had never been taught to build. Meanwhile, Daniel sensed the shift before Elise even realized she was embodying it. Her energy no longer felt like a plea wrapped in softness. It felt like a woman slowly coming home to herself. She texted without urgency. She replied without performing. She allowed silence to exist without filling it with explanations. And through this quiet transformation, Elise discovered something she never expected when she stopped chasing certainty. She started hearing herself more clearly. Her mind softened. Her breath deepened. Her heart stopped bracing for impact. This is the miracle hidden inside repetition once a woman stops trying to escape the pattern and instead studies it. The pattern loses power. Jung believed that the psyche repeats pain not to wound the woman, but to awaken her. Repetition is not a punishment. It is a doorway. It is the unconscious saying, "Look here, not there." The story you are trying to fix in men is actually a story inside you. As days passed, Elise realized she no longer needed Daniel to behave a certain way for her to feel balanced. Emotional sovereignty, something she had spent her entire life seeking from relationships, was quietly rising within her. She no longer interpreted his actions through the lens of fear. She interpreted them through the lens of self-worth. And the irony, the beautiful Jungian irony, is that when Elise no longer needed Daniel to stay, she became the kind of woman a man chooses to stay for, not because she begged, not because she performed, not because she proved her worth, but because she finally embodied the truth she had been longing for: a woman whose value does not fluctuate with someone else's attention. This was no longer about Daniel. It was about Elise becoming conscious of herself. She was breaking the cycle. She was interrupting the wound. She was stepping out of destiny and into agency. And for the first time, the universe responded not to the vibration of her fear, but to the vibration of her becoming. The compulsion to repeat had finally met its match: a woman who refused to abandon herself again. Chapter 5. The Surrender Shift. When she stops fighting her own heart. There comes a moment in every woman's journey when she finally recognizes that the greatest battle she has been fighting is not with men, not with dating, not with fate, but with herself, with the part of her that still believes control is the only way to stay safe. And Elise had reached that moment with a clarity she could no longer ignore. For years, control had been her quiet survival strategy, disguised as composure, masked as emotional intelligence, wrapped in the illusion that if she anticipated every shift, every silence, every subtle change in tone, she could prevent heartbreak before it reached her. But Jung taught that what we try to control eventually controls us, and Elise was beginning to see how the pressure she placed on herself was not protection, it was self-imprisonment. Control for her did not look dramatic. It looked like rereading messages to decode hidden meanings. It looked like drafting replies she never sent. It looked like imagining his perspective, his feelings, his doubts long before he ever voiced them. It looked like trying to stay easy, calm, understanding, even when her heart felt anything but. Control in her world was simply fear wearing the costume of strength. But true strength, Jung insisted, comes not from force, but from surrender, the willingness to let reality be what it is, the courage to meet the moment without manipulating it, the power to remain grounded even when uncertainty shadows the room. And surrender terrified Elise. It felt like losing her footing, like stepping into darkness without a flashlight, like trusting a bridge she had never walked before. But something inside her, what Jung would call the self, was whispering that the life she wanted could not be reached through control. It could only be reached through release. That realization struck her on a quiet afternoon when Daniel didn't reply to a message she had sent hours earlier. Normally, she would have spiraled, checking the time, checking his social media activity, rereading their last conversation, to make sure she hadn't said anything wrong, letting her mind twist silence into a prophecy. But this time, she placed her phone face down, exhaled slowly, and whispered to herself, "I am safe, even when I don't know." The sentence felt unfamiliar, like a language she was still learning to speak. Her body resisted it. Her heart thudded in protest. Her nervous system buzzed with old memories. But she stayed. She chose the uncomfortable stillness instead of the familiar panic. And in that stillness, she met the truth she had been avoiding. She wasn't trying to control Daniel. She was trying to control the part of herself she feared would break if he didn't choose her. Surrender, Jung said, is not passive. It is an act of profound bravery, the ability to stand still while every old story inside you begs to run. Elise was finally learning how to stand still. She began noticing the micro moments where control tried to reclaim its throne, the urge to check her phone, the impulse to predict his thoughts, the instinct to preemptively apologize for something she didn't do, the tension that rose whenever she felt emotionally exposed. Instead of obeying these impulses, she observed them. Jung called this the birth of consciousness, the moment a woman steps out of her automatic behaviors and becomes aware of the inner forces directing her life. And awareness, once awakened, does not fall asleep again. Over the next days, Elise practiced surrender the way others practice, breathing slowly, intentionally, imperfectly. When she worried that he was losing interest, she said, "This is fear, not fact." When she felt the urge to send a long reassurance message, she asked, "Is this coming from love or from anxiety?" When she imagined him drifting away, she reminded herself, "If something is meant for me, I will not have to chase it." But surrender did not mean she stopped caring. It meant she stopped negotiating her worth. It meant she stopped treating connection like a test she had to pass. It meant she allowed Daniel to be a man, not a mirror for her wounds. Jung believed that surrender is possible only when a woman trusts her own inner center, and Elise was finally anchoring into hers. One evening, while journaling, she wrote a sentence that felt like a doorway opening inside her. "I cannot receive love while clinging to fear." The words echoed through her chest like a truth she had always known but never understood. Fear had been running her relationships for years, not because she was weak, but because she had been conditioned to build emotional safety through control, to hold on tightly so she would not disappear in someone's uncertainty. But now she was learning something radical. Surrender is not giving up. Surrender is giving back responsibility. It is telling the universe, "I no longer force what is not aligned," and telling herself, "I will not abandon my heart just to feel chosen." And the more she surrendered, the more her energy softened. Daniel, without knowing why, felt more comfortable around her, more drawn in, more present. Her energy no longer reached for him, it invited him. Her silence no longer felt like tension, it felt like depth. Her presence no longer felt like pressure, it felt like space. And in that space, something beautiful emerged: authenticity. Elise was no longer performing. She was no longer shrinking or stretching to fit an imagined ideal. She was showing up as herself. Quiet at times, emotional at times, thoughtful, intuitive, beautifully imperfect. And it was this woman, not the controlled one, not the curated one, not the masked one, who held the power to attract what was truly meant for her. Jung taught that relationships are not transformed through effort, but through consciousness. And Elise was becoming conscious. She was no longer fighting uncertainty. She was befriending it. She was no longer reacting to her triggers. She was decoding them. She was no longer using control as a shield. She was letting surrender reveal what needed to be seen. And though surrender felt terrifying at first, it soon revealed its greatest gift: clarity. Without the noise of fear dictating her reactions, Elise began seeing Daniel for who he truly was not, through the lens of longing, not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of truth. She could finally ask herself, does this man add peace to my life or take it away? Does he meet me in reciprocity or does he meet me in convenience? Does he see the woman I am becoming or only the woman I used to be? These questions were not desperate, they were discerning. This was the difference between a woman who chases and a woman who surrenders. The first seeks approval, the second seeks alignment. and Elise was becoming aligned, not with Daniel, with herself. Surrender had not made her lose control. It had returned control to the only place it ever belonged within her. She didn't know where the relationship was heading. She didn't know if Daniel was her future or just a chapter. She didn't know if stillness would lead to connection or closure. But she knew this. She would no longer sacrifice herself for certainty. And that was the moment her frequency changed forever. The moment she realized she could withstand the unknown without collapsing. The moment she felt the weight she had carried for years begin to lift. The moment she stepped not into a man's embrace, but into her own. Because a woman who surrenders does not fall. She rises. She rises into truth, into power, into presence, into the woman she was always meant to be. Chapter 6. The Power of Presence. When she becomes her own home. Presence is a word many women hear, but few truly understand, and even fewer know how to embody. Yet presence is the very energy Elise had been missing her entire life. The grounded, magnetic, effortless being that exists when a woman finally stops living from anticipation fear or self-monitoring, and instead returns fully to the moment, fully into her body, fully into herself. Presence is not about calmness, though calmness may come. It is not about silence, though silence becomes nourishing. It is not about confidence, though confidence naturally rises. It is the state in which a woman stops abandoning herself. In real time, the state Jung believed was the closest expression of the self whole, unfragmented, undivided. Elise did not realize she had been living outside of herself for years, hovering a few inches above her body, always scanning, assessing, predicting, operating in hyper-awareness of other people's needs, moods, and reactions. A skill she had developed in childhood to survive emotional unpredictability, but a skill that in adulthood robbed her of her own center. When Daniel spoke, she listened, but her nervous system listened harder, searching for clues, trying to forecast intimacy, trying to anticipate distance. When he was present, she felt relief. When he was quiet, she felt panic. Her emotional home had never been inside her. It had been inside other people. And yet presence requires the opposite. Presence requires a woman to come home to herself, to inhabit her own internal space so completely that she no longer depends on external anchors to feel steady. Elise's shift toward presence began in a moment that seemed insignificant at first. She was washing dishes, warm water running over her hands, a soft hum from the refrigerator in the background. Nothing dramatic, nothing poetic, until she suddenly realized that for the first time in weeks, her mind was not running toward Daniel, not replaying conversations, not imagining future scenarios, not bracing for disappointment. She was simply here, just as she was, breathing, moving, existing. And in that realization, something clicked, the understanding that presence is not found through effort. It is found through noticing. Jung said that what a woman becomes conscious of, she gains the ability to choose, and Elise realized she had never chosen presence before. She had only chosen survival. From that moment, she began practicing presence in small, almost invisible ways. When her thoughts tried to sprint into the future, will he text? Is he losing interest? Did I do something wrong? She returned to her breath. When her anxiety tried to interpret silence as danger, she placed a hand on her chest and said gently, "I am here." When she felt the familiar pull to escape into overthinking, she anchored into physical sensation, the warmth of her coffee mug, the texture of the fabric beneath her fingertips, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Presence was beginning to feel like home, not because Daniel gave it to her, but because she was learning to give it to herself. And the more Elise embodied presence, the more her energy changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Men are drawn to presence, not performance. Life is drawn to presence, not pressure. Presence radiates without trying, communicates without speaking, and holds without gripping. When a woman is present, she is not waiting. She is. She is not proving she is. She is not anticipating she is. Presence is a frequency, and frequency is irresistible. It was not long before Daniel noticed the shift. Conversations with Elise felt lighter, grounded, unhurried. Her pauses no longer carried tension. They carried depth. Her eyes no longer searched for reassurance. They rested calmly in his. Her voice no longer carried the undertone of fear. It carried the weight of a woman, rooted in herself. For the first time since he met her, Daniel felt her not the projection, not the persona, not the fear, but her. And yet the beauty of presence is that it is never about the other person. It is about the woman reclaiming the parts of herself she had abandoned. Elise found herself enjoying moments alone, not as placeholders between messages, but as nourishment. She found peace in the mundane morning sunlight on the floor, the quiet ritual of making tea, the soft exhale before sleep. She stopped rushing toward future outcomes. She stopped answering questions no one had asked. She stopped imagining stories that didn't exist. She stopped negotiating her worth. Jung believed that when a woman returns to herself, she becomes luminous, not because she changes, but because she reveals what was always there. And Elise was beginning to glow in a way she couldn't yet see, but everyone around her could feel. Presence also gifted her something she had been missing her entire life: discernment. From presence, she could finally ask, is this connection nourishing me or draining me? Is this man showing up, or am I filling in the spaces with fantasy? Is this relationship aligned with my growth or merely comforting my wounds? These questions rise naturally when a woman stands in her own center because she is no longer viewing the relationship from fear but from truth. And the truth was this: she liked Daniel, but she no longer needed him. She enjoyed his presence, but she no longer collapsed into the absence. She cared for the connection, but she no longer feared its fragility. Presence gave her options she never had before, options that only appear when a woman stops defining herself through someone else's behavior. One evening, as she sat watching the sunset bleed across her living room wall, Elise realized something that shook her to her core. For the first time, she felt whole without someone loving her. Not healed, not finished, but whole. This was the essence of Jung's individuation, the process of becoming the woman she was meant to be, not through attachment to another, but through union with her own self. Presence was not the absence of longing, it was the absence of self-abandonment. Presence was not the end of desire, it was the end of desperation. Presence was not emotional perfection, it was emotional sovereignty. And sovereignty for a woman is the birthplace of attraction, not the forced, effortful, fear-driven attraction of her past, but the quiet, gravitational, organic attraction of a woman who knows who she is. The world responds to presence with reverence. Men respond to presence with clarity. Opportunities respond to presence with alignment. And Elise was becoming a woman whose very being shifted the air around her. She did not need to chase anything anymore. Not love, not certainty, not validation. Because presence had revealed something she had forgotten: she was the home she had been searching for. A woman who becomes her own home does not fear losing someone who leaves. A woman who becomes her own home does not settle for someone who cannot meet her. A woman who becomes her own home does not confuse anxiety with intuition. A woman who becomes her own home vibrates at a frequency that calls in what is meant for her and repels what is not. Elise was stepping into this truth fully now, slowly, quietly, powerfully. And with each day she spent anchored in presence, the next phase of her transformation waited, because presence, while powerful, is only the beginning. The real shift comes when she learns to detach vibrationally, not from love, not from men, but from the fear that once dictated the rhythm of her entire emotional world. Chapter 7. Vibrational Detachment. When she stops running from herself. Detachment is a word many women misunderstand, imagining it as coldness, indifference, or withdrawal. But Jung would say true detachment is not distance from others. It is distance from fear. Distance from old identity, distance from the compulsive need to be chosen in order to feel whole. And Elise was about to learn that vibrational detachment is the moment a woman stops negotiating her worth with the world and begins embodying it from within. For most of her life, Elise believed attachment was proof of love, that longing was evidence of depth, that anxiety meant she cared, and so she clung tightly to the men who stirred something inside her, not out of obsession, but out of survival, out of the belief that if she loosened her grip even slightly, everything she wanted would slip away. But the truth was that the harder she held on, the more unstable she felt. Jung believed that the psyche clings only to what it has not yet integrated, and Elise's attachment had never been about Daniel or any man before him. It had always been about the unhealed girl within her, who believed she needed someone else to stabilize her emotional world. But presence had already opened a new doorway for her, and now detachment would ask her to walk through it. It began, as most awakenings do, with a moment of unexpected clarity. Elise woke one morning with sunlight pooling softly across her bedsheets, her phone resting silently by her side, and for the first time in years, she felt no urgency to reach for it. She didn't need confirmation of someone's affection to start her day. She didn't need reassurance to stabilize her breath. Her nervous system was quiet, grounded steady, like the surface of a lake untouched by wind. And in that stillness, she realized something profound. The peace she had been trying to extract from relationships was never meant to come from another person. It was meant to come from herself. This was not avoidance. This was not dismissal. This was power. Vibrational detachment means learning to separate your internal state from another person's behavior, learning to feel secure even when outcomes are uncertain, learning to remain open without collapsing into longing. And Jung believed this is the moment a woman steps into psychological adulthood, the moment she stops relating to men from the perspective of her wounded child and begins relating from the wholeness of her emerging self. Elise felt this shift most clearly when Daniel's messages grew inconsistent, something that would have previously spiraled her into panic, self-doubt, overanalyzing every conversation. But this time she simply noticed, not with fear, with observation. He is showing me who he is, she thought, and I am free to respond from who I am becoming. This is vibrational detachment, not checking out, but checking inward. Instead of asking, does he still want me? She asked, do I still feel aligned with this? Instead of asking, am I enough for him? She asked, is this connection enough for me? Instead of shrinking to maintain harmony, she expanded to maintain truth. And the more she detached from the outcome, the more she aligned with her own center. This alignment began altering her frequency in ways both subtle and unmistakable. For the first time, Elise felt the difference between wanting someone and needing them. Wanting was open, warm, grounded. Needing was anxious, tight, desperate. Wanting allowed her to choose. Needing forced her to cling. Her energy was transforming from grasping to receiving, from tension to softness, from survival to sovereignty. Jung believed that once a woman begins to individuate, become her true self, she will release anything that threatens her inner wholeness, not out of bitterness, but out of resonance. And Elise, without consciously deciding to, began distancing herself from emotional breadcrumbs, gray zone interest, inconsistent effort, and half-hearted connection, not because she was playing games, but because her frequency no longer tolerated what once felt familiar. This is the quiet magic of vibrational detachment. A woman no longer chases clarity. Unclear people fade on their own. Daniel noticed the shift before Elise ever expressed it. She no longer filled silences with explanations. She no longer rushed to respond. She no longer offered emotional labor he hadn't earned. She no longer calibrated herself to his moods. Her energy was no longer reaching, it was radiating. Her presence was no longer seeking, it was choosing. And though he felt drawn to her, he also felt the unmistakable weight of responsibility rise within him. Because a woman who is no longer afraid to lose someone becomes a woman impossible to take for granted. Meanwhile, Elise was experiencing something even more powerful: emotional self-trust. Self-trust is what emerges when a woman detaches from fantasy and sees people clearly, when she stops telling herself stories to justify inconsistency, when she stops hoping someone will change and begins asking whether she still wants them as they are. This new clarity made her feel both liberated and strangely tender. She realized she had spent so much of her life loving men's potential, loving the hope of who they might become, loving the version of them she built inside her imagination, but detachment shattered fantasy and replaced it with vision. And in that vision, she saw that Daniel, while kind and gentle, was not choosing her with the same intention she was choosing herself. And for the first time, that was enough reason not to stay. Jung taught that a woman's wholeness demands a different kind of love rooted in reciprocity, presence, and truth. Not the addictive highs of anxious attachment, not the unpredictable rhythm of inconsistent affection, but the grounded, steady energy of a partnership between two individuals who have each met their shadow and learned to love from their self rather than from their wounds. Elise knew this now. She felt it in her bones. So one evening, as she sat on her balcony watching the city lights flicker like small universes below her, she felt no bitterness, no regret, no heartbreak, only clarity. She no longer needed Daniel to stay in order to feel whole. She no longer needed answers to feel closure. She no longer needed reassurance to feel calm. She whispered to herself with a softness that felt like a new beginning, I release what is not aligned. I keep what is true. And with that whisper, her frequency shifted once more, not into coldness, but into freedom. True vibrational detachment is not the death of love. It is the birth of self-honoring. It is the moment a woman realizes she can love deeply without losing herself, hope courageously without clinging, open her heart without surrendering her center. And from that moment forward, life responds to her differently. Aligned men feel drawn. Unaligned men drift away. Opportunities expand. Boundaries sharpen. Intuition strengthens. The world rearranges itself around the vibration she now carries. Jung believed that when a woman stops abandoning herself, the universe stops abandoning her as well, because reality mirrors her inner state, and Elise had finally become the reflection she had spent years searching for in others. She did not know what would come next, but she knew this. She would never shrink again. She would never chase again. She would never settle again. She would never confuse anxiety for chemistry again. She would never mistake attachment for love again. She had become the woman her younger self needed, the woman her older self would be proud of, the woman her present self could finally rest inside. And with that, her journey of pain became a journey of power. Her journey of fear became a journey of awakening. Her journey of longing became a journey of self. Elise was no longer running toward love or away from loss. She was simply walking fully, freely, and finally as herself. Conclusion: the woman who no longer seeks permission to exist. Every journey of awakening has a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when a woman realizes she is no longer the same person she was when the story began. And as Elise stood on the threshold of her new life, she felt something inside her settle with a depth she had never known, a depth that had nothing to do with Daniel or any man or any relationship, but everything to do with the woman she had become. Her past self had lived in anticipation of abandonment, anticipation of approval, anticipation of rejection, anticipation of the next emotional shift that would tell her who she needed to be. But the woman standing here now no longer lived in anticipation. She lived in awareness, a steady calm, grounded awareness of her own energy, her own truth, her own worth, her own path. And Jung would say, this is the moment a woman enters herself, the moment her soul steps forward and her persona steps aside, the moment her shadow is no longer an enemy, but a guide, the moment she stops performing the version of herself she once thought the world required and begins embodying the woman she was always meant to be. Elise's transformation was not the dramatic, fiery rebirth she once imagined healing would look like. It was quiet, subtle, like the long exhale she didn't realize she had been holding for years, finally leaving her body. And as she breathed into this new chapter, she understood something essential. Her life had not been falling apart all those years. It had been trying to get her attention. Every heartbreak had been a message. Every silence had been a mirror. Every repeated pattern had been a teacher. Every man who could not stay had been a lesson, not about their failure, but about the parts of herself she still needed to meet. Jung said that until a woman turns inward, she will search the world for the pieces of herself she lost. But once she faces her shadow, once she speaks to her wounds, once she chooses herself, above her fear, the world stops being a battlefield and becomes a reflection of her inner harmony. And as Elise looked back at her own life, she could finally see that nothing had been accidental. The abandonment she felt as a child had taught her how deeply she longed for stable connection. The heartbreak she endured in adolescence had revealed the depth of her capacity to love. The confusing relationships in adulthood had exposed where she still abandoned herself. The anxiety she felt in connection had been a compass, pointing her toward the parts of her still living in the past. The patterns she repeated had been the doorway to her liberation. And now, having stepped through that doorway, she saw herself differently, fully, clearly, unapologetically. She no longer saw a woman who was too much. She saw a woman whose depth required someone capable of meeting it. She no longer saw a woman who was not enough. She saw a woman who had spent years underestimating her own power. She no longer saw a woman who loved too hard. She saw a woman whose heart was a cathedral, sacred, expansive, worthy of reverence. She no longer saw a woman who couldn't let go. She saw a woman whose loyalty had simply been misplaced in the arms of those who could not hold it. This clarity was not ego, it was self. And the self Jung insisted is the highest expression of a woman's psychology, the union of her light and her darkness, her fear and her courage, her longing and her wisdom, her softness, and her strength, her past, and her becoming. Elise understood now that the journey had never been about finding the right man. It had been about becoming the right woman for her own life. A woman who chooses from alignment, not anxiety. A woman who speaks from truth, not fear. A woman who stays present, not performative. A woman who can love without losing herself. A woman who can walk away without collapsing. A woman who does not chase what withdraws because she knows that what is meant for her will meet her without needing to be pursued. And as this understanding rooted itself in her soul, Elise realized something almost spiritual. When she stopped chasing love, love began chasing her, not because of tactics, not because of strategy, not because of withholding affection, but because her energy was now coherent, magnetic, sovereign. The universe responds to coherence. Men respond to sovereignty. Life responds to a woman who is whole. Elise knew now that her future relationships would not be built on fear. They would be built on reciprocity. She would no longer fall for potential. She would choose presence. She would no longer remain in confusion. She would seek clarity. She would no longer hand out emotional intimacy to the unprepared. She would require depth. She would no longer be swayed by inconsistent affection. She would be moved only by devotion. And she would no longer bend herself into the shape of someone's preference. She would stand fully in the shape of her truth. Yet the most profound shift of all was this: she no longer needed a relationship to feel complete. She wanted partnership. Yes, wanted warmth, wanted connection, wanted someone who could meet her, see her, cherish her, but she no longer needed it to define her. Jung taught that the ultimate goal of individuation is to become at home within oneself, and Elise was finally home. She had become her own emotional sanctuary, her own mirror, her own comfort, her own witness, her own protector, her own truth. And from that place, connection could only enhance her life, never complete it. For the first time, she felt ready not for love, but for herself. Ready to live not from the wound, but from the woman. Ready to choose not from fear, but from alignment. Ready to rise not from desperation, but from embodiment. And as she stepped forward into uncertainty, into softness, into destiny, she carried with her the final truth her journey had revealed. When a woman stops running from herself, everything meant for her begins to run toward her, not because she chases, but because she radiates. The world rearranges itself around the woman who remembers her worth, and Elise finally, beautifully, irrevocably remembered.